Oneness, togetherness, oneness, love. Hey, brothers and sisters, this is the greatest day of your life. I tell you, he's brought togetherness. Jimmy, ladies and gentlemen from Kingston, Jamaica, Jimmy Lee.
And hello everybody, you're welcome back again to the Reggae Appreciation Society. The 5-decade-long oppressive policy of apartheid in South Africa was one of the last causes that truly united the most of the world in the 20th century. It inspired numerous sanctions designed to bring about the abandonment of racial segregation in that country. But in addition to the political, economic and diplomatic pressure on South Africa, a very stringent and devastating cultural boycott would also prove to be a very telling weapon, with British rock bands like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones all refusing to play there from the early 1960s. It was considered a taboo for a musician to agree to go over there to perform, but in 1980, legendary reggae artist Jimmy Cliff totally changed the narrative and approach to that struggle by agreeing to play a concert there as part of his massive world tour. It was a decision that shocked many and brought a brutal backlash against him at the time. It would prove to be a masterstroke that produced more results than 2 decades of an outright musical boycott. Instead of merely putting pressure on the apartheid regime to end segregation, Jimmy Cliff's decision would send tectonic shockwaves right through the heart of South African society itself, effectively uniting people of all races, at least for one night, and hitting apartheid with a deadly blow that it would never recover from. The fallout of that event would terrify the apartheid regime, and the authorities would go into full panic mode. They began to screen or outrightly refusing to allow reggae artists into their country, as they were scared that they had the power to unite South Africans. Let's take a look at how Jimmy Cliff's 1980 concert in Soweto broke apartheid. Now, to begin with, Cliff's groundbreaking exploits in South Africa hadn't just been an overnight thing. He had been the first artist to truly emerge as a superstar on the African continent by the early to mid-1970s, when his masterpiece album, House of Exile, would literally set that continent alight when it was released in 1974. On the strength of that release, he would develop a religious following in Africa and would go on to tour in different countries like Zambia and Nigeria, where he was an absolute idol. And in 1975, Jimmy Cliff would get an invitation to come and perform in South Africa. Apparently, he had a massive fan base in that country, and the promoters just knew that any show with him in it would be a huge success. But that was the peak of the cultural boycott, and despite the insane amounts of money he was offered, he decided not to accept it. But deep in his heart, Jimmy wasn't happy that he was being kept apart from his fans and compatriots in South Africa. He was all for other forms of sanctions, but confided in close friends that it was frustrating making music to inspire and motivate the South African people, but not being able to go over there and perform for them. The cultural war against South Africa would keep raging on to the end of the 1970s, and by then, Jimmy had played all over the continent, except over there. However, by early 1980, he was scheduled to go on a massive world tour that was slated to have him perform in the US, Brazil, and most of Europe. And he once again received an offer to perform in South Africa at the Orlando Stadium in Soweto and 2 other venues. His manager Don Taylor, who had been Bob Marley's manager before him, ignored the offer and didn't give it any attention, but was stunned when Jimmy Cliff himself said he wanted to play that concert. As far as Don Taylor was concerned, it was simply career suicide to even consider it. But Jimmy made it clear that he would face the consequences that would come for it. But first things first, he just had to give his suffering brethren a show that they would remember for years to come. So faced with no other option, Don Taylor would close the deal and began to make arrangements for a controversial trip to South Africa. Jimmy Cliff and his elite backing group, the Oneness Band, that had master instrumentalists like Ansel Collins, Earl China Smith, and Uzziah Sticky Thompson, were slated to perform at 3 venues. The first show was supposed to be in Soweto, the second in Durban, and the final in Cape Town. They didn't know what to expect when they landed in that country, but were greeted by a throng of reporters and media people at the airport and were shocked by the amazing reception that they had gotten. And from all indications, the arrival of Jimmy Cliff had electrified the entire country. To get an idea of how big he was over there, Jimmy Cliff's cover of Bob Marley's No Woman No Cry has sold over 1 million copies in South Africa alone. So on the day of the Soweto show, a bus came to pick them up from the hotel to ferry them to the venue. And to their surprise, the bus driver was a white dude. And to make it more interesting, he had no idea of how to get to the Soweto Stadium, which was in the black part of town, which he had never been to in his life. They would ask for instructions from a group of kids playing soccer in the streets and would make their way to the stadium, but were simply stunned at the sight that awaited them. They knew there would be a large crowd over there, but were shocked to see thousands of people who were waiting outside that 60,000 capacity stadium that was already full to the brim. And as they made their way in through the gates, the fans went wild in excitement when they heard that Jimmy Cliff had arrived, and countless people would literally swarm the bus as he tried to make his way in. To make way for Jimmy and his band to reach the stage, a squad of soldiers had to form a ring around them and push their way through as tens of thousands of fans repeatedly screamed Jimmy Cliff's name over and over. But as they made their way nearer to the stage, it seemed the sight of the soldiers in their uniforms, which represented the garb of their oppressors, enraged that audience, and they would launch thousands of stones, shoes, and every conceivable object that they could find at them. Jimmy immediately recognized the cause of the chaos and tried to beg the commanding officer to stay where he was and allow him to climb the stage and talk to the audience. But the officer refused on the grounds that he was following instructions from headquarters. But before he could finish making a statement, a well-aimed Coca-Cola bottle flew through the air and struck the officer in the face, immediately drawing a stream of blood. And Jimmy feared that the soldiers would retaliate by shooting into the crowd and quickly seize the initiative. He would force his way past the soldiers and ran up the stage with a clenched fist high above his head in what was a symbol of unity and resistance that was known in that country as the Amandla Salute. That seemed to slow the tempo of the missiles, and he took the microphone and begged the crowd to stop throwing bottles and allow them to entertain them using the power of reggae music. That did the magic as the missiles stopped flying and the show was allowed to kick off. Jimmy and the Oneness Band took positions on stage and slipped into gear. Jimmy's opening song was a smash hit, You Can Get It If You Really Want, and the crowd's rapturous response would almost break the stadium in half. It had been several years in the pipeline, but now he was in South Africa in front of his people, and he would undertake to give the audience a night that they would never forget. Song after song, Jimmy and his band totally killed it. His rendition of No Woman No Cry and the amazing song Wonderful World, Beautiful People drove the audience into a frenzy. And what was most astonishing about the whole show was that for a country that was practicing an official and state-backed racial segregation policy, you would never have guessed just looking at the crowd, with 60,000 people that were made up of whites, blacks and Indians were holding hands and dancing their butts off together. And while Jimmy and his band were surprised, the soldiers in the stadium were shocked with their jaws almost to the floor. According to legendary reggae artist manager Couplon Forbes, who was in charge of logistics for that tour, while Jimmy was in full flight, seriously working that crowd, a rope would appear from the back of that stage, and a man dressed in a full Zulu warrior outfit, complete with a shield and short spear called an assegai strapped to his body, climbed over the wall and down onto the stage behind Jimmy. He knelt down before Jimmy and kissed his feet, all the while Jimmy kept on singing, not missing a single beat. And before the security could climb the stage and get him off, the Zulu warrior presented his shield and spear at Jimmy's feet before leaving the stage, to the utmost delight of the screaming crowd. And as the band would later find out, that man lived 15 miles away and couldn't afford the gate fee to enter the stadium, but was determined to see Jimmy and give him those gifts. After 3 incredible hours of Jimmy Cliff at his best, that phenomenal concert came to an end. The band would struggle to get out of that packed stadium and found their way back to their hotel, only to find a huge crowd waiting for them there. A massive black, white and Asian crowd in an area that was whites only, but the authorities couldn't do a thing about it. The show had been a record-breaking success and was all over the news for its brilliance. But the most telling fact about it was the huge number of people who had flouted South Africa's laws of racial segregation. It was held in a black area, but white and Asian folk in their tens of thousands had flocked over there regardless. This sorely worried the authorities, who had never seen such happen in the 4 decades since Apartheid was introduced officially. And after that show, Jimmy and his band would go sightseeing around Johannesburg's numerous historical sites. But everywhere they went, they noticed that they were seeing the same faces over and over, and discovered that they were being followed by undercover security personnel from place to place. The apartheid regime had seen the power of Jimmy's music and had to be sure that Jimmy and his group wouldn't try to spark any uprisings while they were still on South African soil. They would go on to do 2 more venues in Durban and Cape Town, places that were a lot more uptown and less ghetto. In other words, a lot more orderly, but I'm sure a lot less fun. That show in Soweto was the first reggae concert in South Africa and had an real impact on that country's music scene. Among many things to note, a record producer stroke artist from Soweto who was called Richie Siluma was at that concert and had experienced something of his religious experience. And when he got home, he convinced his 16-year-old cousin, who was an upcoming singer in a pop band that he was managing, to become a reggae artist. And that teenager, called Lucky Dube, took his advice and went on to become the biggest reggae star to emerge from that country. And now with all their shows done, Jimmy and his band will jet off to Brazil for the next stop in their tour. The impact of his show in Soweto was so great that 6 months after, he and some band members tried to get visas to visit South Africa but had their applications denied. And the grounds for refusal were never officially given. But after Jimmy's crew did some digging, they learned from a source in the embassy that the authorities were really concerned about Jimmy's ability to unite that country and weren't ready to risk him coming back in. It would take another 10 years plus for apartheid to truly die in South Africa, but it's gone down in the history of that country that what signaled the end of segregation was that unforgettable night in Soweto when Jimmy Cliff brought together thousands of people of different colors who were forbidden to unite and truly prove that the South Africans, regardless of the color of their skin, could truly come together as one people. So there you have it. Thank you for watching the video today. Please leave a like, subscribe, and until next time, God bless.